everyone. My name is Lyel Resner. I'm one of the organizers of the Startups in Society Initiative, also the head of Public Interest Technology Studio at Cornell Tech. Welcome. Hopefully some of you are joining us from the extraordinary conversation with Davida Herzl around why she converted to a public benefit corporation when raising a $40 million Series B. We have another wonderful conversation lined up for you right now. We are going to talk about how you can build good into the DNA of your company from the very beginning. And I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists who can all speak to that issue, I think, in a super thoughtful, nuanced way. So first of all, we have Chapman Snowden. Chap is the CEO and founder of Brick App. Brick is the financial tool set that helps general contractors grow their business. Chap recently completed YC and closed his seed round. Chap, if you could join us on stage. Next, we have Rhonda Allen, the CEO of Devcolor. Devcolor is the global career accelerator for Black software engineers, technologists, and executives, and the go-to accountability partner for over 500 companies who invest in, employ, and are being led by them. And lastly, we have my dear friend Arthur Woods. Arthur is a co-founder of Matheson, Bain Capital-backed hiring platform to source diverse candidates and reduce bias in the hiring process. So, hey everyone, it's so good to see you.
Hello.
Thanks for joining. Just real quick, so that the people that are just joining us here have a sense of context. This is a hybrid conference, and it seems like we have 15 people with us virtually. We have another 50 or so live in person here at BetaWorks Studios, which is really exciting and was somewhat logistically difficult, but we're grateful to the BetaWorks team here. But to kind of feed into that sense of this being a conversation taking place globally, frankly, could each of you share, maybe Chap, Rhonda, and then Arthur, where you're calling in from?
Yeah, I'm calling in from Oakland, California.
I'm calling in from DC, just made it back from the Bay.
And I am currently calling in from Las Vegas, but I promise I'm working today. I'm not having fun. I'm the only one here working and not having fun. Yeah.
And well, normally based in Miami, right? So
That's right.
Yeah, fun and work.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So let's start here. I think if you were listening to the previous conversation, you heard Davida talk a little bit about how she wished she had incorporated as a public benefit corporation from the beginning. I think she found many of the decisions that were important to her more difficult to say, like retrofit. Yeah. And so I'm curious, kind of for the group, and maybe we'll start with Chap. Like, what are some of the decisions that you've made at the seed stage that kind of most reflect your values? And can you talk a little bit about whether or how these decisions had either business motivations or business implications?
Yeah, the way that my founding team and I thought about this was like, we first had to figure out what was like, ethical decisions can expand everywhere, right? And I think for us, it was trying to figure out what was the one core thing that we could not violate and continue to be a company that is doing that we wanted to do, right? We work in the home improvement space. We handle money. Trust is clearly sort of the thing that we cannot violate from either the homeowner perspective, from the general contractor perspective. And so that sort of became sort of like, ground zero for every decision that we make around everything from setting up like how we think about a product positioning, how we think about our value prop. Like we're a big fan of like, if you show me the incentive structure, I will show you the outcomes. I think it was Charlie Munger that said that. Like, and that informed before we wrote a line of code, before we thought about hiring, how do we set our company up in an incentive structure way such that we can have the greatest probability of not violating trust, right? And from there, like what we think about sort of like all of the ethical decisions that can violate that. They're not sort of one-off decisions. There's a set of intricate interactions, like what led a group of people to feel like they could make that decision, what happened from that decision. Like this is sort of ethics to me is a horizontal component of your like culture stack. And so the first thing that we set out to do before we even hired anybody was like, what are the priorities and what are the sort of organizational principles that we have that will reduce the likelihood that we violate that, right? We're not so naive to say that it won't happen at some point, but reducing the likelihood was really important to us. And the way that we do that is we think about our sort of principles in like an X over Y perspective. Like, for example, like, everybody wants to say that, we prioritize our customers. Well, prioritize customers over what, right? What's the trade-off that happens when you see the ethical decisions being compromised? And I think, we got there because we've seen a lot of fintech companies. We are generally sort of the intersection of fintech and proptech, like probably Robinhood being one of the most notable ones, like be called out for a lot of sort of like quasi-ethical sort of violations recently. And I think for us, we wanted to make sure that like, if we were going to sacrifice something, what is the sacrifice over, right? So are we, a good example for us is like, we think that transparency is sacrifice, and transparency is a core value, like core underpinning of trust. Transparency is always sacrifice over speed, right? It's, hey, we need to get this done. We need to get this out for some deadline for an investor. And for us, we have clearly said that like we prioritize transparency over everything else. And that means that everybody in my team should know that, and everybody should feel like if we owe something externally, internally, and we're not going to make it, or we feel like we have to err on reducing transparency, like it is on me and my team to sort of push back and say, this is a core value of ours because we believe trust is paramount for all of us. Here's how I will help push back on the speed pressure in order to make sure that we live up to our transparency.
That's fascinating. I think this idea of ethics as a horizontal component of your culture stack is a really concrete takeaway for founders in the room. And the idea that building incentive structures before everything, understanding your incentive structures means understanding your outcomes. And this concrete example that you've been able to provide around transparency versus speed and building that incentive structure, I think is also super insightful and a concrete takeaway for founders in the room. It seems like increasingly, and certainly in the wake of George Floyd's murder, we've heard a bunch of folks in tech talk about DEI as like a core value that maybe they don't want to violate. Rhonda, your team at Devcolor just released some pretty stark but sadly unsurprising statistics about Black folks in tech. And you also make some recommendations about how companies can get ahead of these issues and truly walk the walk. Can you talk about some recommendations that you have for founders and how they might be able to apply them at the early stages of building a company?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really, really happy to hear trust come out in the first, 3 minutes that we're talking, because the establishment of trust and what happens when trust is broken, the repair of trust, all of that is really foundational to walking the talk of our values. And so one of the things that we did in the middle of the pandemic was really just ask our community. We have hundreds of Black technologists across the industry, and we wanted to know what's really happening on your teams and your companies, and to what extent are your communities at work actually reflecting the stated values. And so for us, releasing this State of Black Tech report was an act of us walking our values, because we wanted to issue a collective call to action, and we wanted to do that in a way that honors our community first. So that's a foundational principle for us. Like we pursue change kind of in a place of both and. So from the inside out, with partnering with the very companies that are either being built or being repaired in some ways, and from the outside in, putting our community first. And so with the promise of confidentiality and aggregate roll-up of perspectives, a couple of themes did emerge as clear calls to action and needs and frankly demands from our community. Building on what Chap talked about around building it right from the start, it's just so critical that there are a diversity of perspectives at every level on your board, on your founding team, like actually taking the time to seek out folks who are different from you and come into the work from a different angle is critical. And not just having them at the table, right? But slowing down to this point about speed to really build genuine connections and honor their perspectives. But there's also this piece around what happens once you have a diverse community internally. How are companies' founders actually responding to the needs and the feedback that they're hearing from their community? So it's not just enough to recruit. It's not just enough to have the core values, as we all know. I mean, feel like in some ways I'm preaching to the choir, but for everyone, right? This gut check and reality check around, where are there gaps between what I'm saying and what I'm doing, and how am I mining those gaps and minding the gaps is really important. So the thing that I will say, in addition to that came up as a really clear theme is that, once you have folks in the door, once you're gathering feedback and perspectives, it still is really critical to make sure that the individuals that you have from diverse backgrounds are not being tasked with doing the work of bringing that DEI strategy to life, right? It's often unpaid, invisible, additional emotional labor outside of the scope of what founders hire us to do that we end up with. And that really takes a toll in many cases. So one of the things that was really, really clear as a concrete step is that, companies and founders need to, one, identify and clarify and name the values, match the actions to the values and mind those gaps, but also in areas where there needs to be real strategic direction, arguably DEI and culture being one of them, hire someone to do that work and partner with organizations that are proximate to the communities you want to engage and the issues you care about.
Super powerful. So I think this idea of that resonates from this conversation and the previous one is, Rhonda, you talked about as something concrete, a concrete way that founders can mind the gap between their values and their actions is, for example, making sure there's a diversity of perspectives at every level, right? And you preceded that with like taking the time to do that.
Right.
And Chap, you had kind of alluded to something else, I think, related but powerful in this idea of like the relationship between speed and transparency. And it seems like you've made the decision in your organization to say that if we don't have the time ultimately to make things transparent in the way that we want, then we're going to sacrifice speed. So I want to kind of talk about this broader idea about the relationship between ethics or social responsibility or your values and kind of business model, because in some ways we're talking about like we're talking about I think the presumption is, given that something takes time, right, that it's a cost center. But I've heard each of you, and Arthur, I know you've thought about this, and Matheson has kind of done concrete things that suggest that you could take the time up front. It might be a cost center up front, but it looks more like an investment. So Arthur, can you talk a little bit about, I know like some of the community involvement work that Matheson has done, even as an early stage company, and some of the broader ways that you advise your clients around the relationship between kind of investing the time up front and business motivations?
Well, first of all, I have to just say how refreshing this conversation is, because most of the time, as we know, entrepreneurs hop in and say, I need to go just start a company, right? What am I going to go do? And if we go back to the core nature of what we're doing, as we launch companies, right? We're trying to solve a problem that realizes a change that we want to see for the world, right? And the very kind of theory of change that, Rhonda, I think you spoke to, and, Chap that you spoke to, I think it really starts with, what do we want our organizations to embody, and what do we want them to resemble? And then how will that change that we see, that theory of change we've developed, actually manifest in the most meaningful way? And that thoughtfulness typically never happens at the very beginning of a company, if we think about it. And the reason is we've placed extraordinary constraints on ourselves and on each other. It's like you're truly, entering uncharted territory with everything, with branches hitting you and wind hitting you and limited resources. And it's like, and you're expecting me to do this thoughtfully. So that thoughtful conversation typically doesn't start to happen until way down the line. And part of that conversation is, what is the composition of my team? Does it reflect society? Do I truly have diversity of thought? Or am I going to, surround myself with the homogenous, maybe folks that I've worked with to date that have been successful with me to date? And that typically is how organizations start. So what that means is DEI becomes something that isn't embedded, we haven't created the environment for it to be embedded in the way that, if we think about even the way that most companies are financed and capitalized and staffed today in the early stages, we haven't really created an environment that's germane to embedding DEI from the ground up. So I think just the thoughtful nature of this conversation, to me, is exactly what entrepreneurs need to be hearing. At the very beginning, if we can sit around the table and say, if I have this theory of change for the way I want to see the world, differently manifest because of my idea, how am I going to create that and navigate that uncharted territory in the most thoughtful way? And it just becomes so clear that diversity of thought and diversity of representation is the only way. It's not just a right way. It is the only way to bring our ideas to life, given the crazy degree of complexity that we're navigating, And so what we saw really for most entrepreneurs is they would see a great deal of success. They'd eventually realize their entire leadership team was homogenous, and they'd say, we have a diversity issue. And at that stage, they'd say, we need to bring in, as Rhonda was mentioning, oftentimes we need to go tokenize the few underrepresented team members we already have. We need to ask them to go fix this for us. Or we need to, find a way to now do this retroactively. And the work only gets harder the larger our organizations get, because we cement processes, we institutionalize our values the greater we get, or the larger we get. And so it becomes a change management effort versus an embedding and sort of investing effort. So I really love your point about, as we're thinking about the foundation, the infrastructure we're building from the ground up, if we're embedding this ethos at the beginning, we're really setting this work up to be embedded and to be scaled. Because I'll tell you, we navigate now with hundreds of organizations that have realized they have a challenge, and they're trying to retroactively change their culture, change their systems, change the hearts of their people. And they're struggling immensely to do it, rightfully so. And Ron, I know these are all the folks that you're working with, who are coming to you saying, we have an issue. How can we retroactively change? So the earlier we can have this thoughtful conversation, I think the better.
Yeah. If I can add one thing to that, yes. When we think about, building right from the start, I think it has to go further than representation, right? So we can commit to diverse cap tables, we can commit to have seats on the executive team, et cetera. But the extent to which there is equity of power and influence and making decisions that impact the direction of the company, got tongue tied, that's where it counts, So I would just say it's not enough to say, okay, I don't pay now or pay later. I'm going to just go ahead and do that now. Yeah. But like the folks that you bring in, truly entrusting them with the same level of direction, autonomy, and power, and democratizing that in a way that you're moving forward together. I think that's where the transformation potential comes to bear.
I love that, Rhonda. If I would just build on that, the thing that we've also seen is this lack of psychological safety in most organizations. Sure. And I think trust, we talked about trust earlier, the greatest litmus test for trust and safety has been how organizations are navigating this return to office, right? And one of the great things about, I think, a lot of early stage companies is they've realized we have to trust our people, the simple nature of the fact that we're no longer sitting next to each other, But I think to your point, if we're not building in the equity, if also we're not building in the inclusion and the psychological safety, representation is really just one of many things that we need to be accounting for.
For sure.
Chap, did you want to jump in?
And I was going to say, I think all of this is true and right. And I think there's also something that is very true from an early stage founder that you just have to be willing to take on, which is like all of this is a fundamentally different sort of like risk vector as an early stage startup that you as a either founder or founding team have to be willing to take on, right? It is in the myriad of building a business and all of that, like it is still an entirely different effort that even if you're conscious about it, it will take time, it takes thoughtfulness, you'll have to actively defend it against any early stage investor that you have, because there's, back to an incentive structure, it's regardless of whether or not the person is relevant to my business, it's really easy to say, hey, I hired so-and-so from who's an early Stripe employee or something like that, and I get credit for it, right? In a way that I don't often get credit for, I hired somebody who does not have a great pedigree, but here's the asymmetric bet that I made on them that I think will pay off for me soon. And I think the mentality there is that it's really easy for especially sort of like Bay Area startups to really think about themselves as, we just need to be consumers of talent. We need to focus on folks who come from top tier schools or top tier companies and things like that, as opposed to producers of talent. Because the sad fact is that just like not a lot of companies there's not enough of a bedrock of companies that have gotten all of this right from the beginning to say, great, if we just steal folks from XYZ company, we will inherit the sort of like, core operating system that we want to see happen in the future. You have to be willing to like actively produce that. At the same time, you're fundraising, building a company, and managing your Twitter profile or whatever else it is.
I think this is a really essential point, which is while hopefully it seems to be increasingly true that there are liabilities associated with not getting some of these things right, in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of reputation. Mm-hmm. And there are rewards for getting them right, attracting and retaining diverse talent, building trust and consumer loyalty in an increasingly kind of distrustful tech environment. It's still not the norm, and definitely in the Bay. Yeah. And to Chap's point, like I think for founders, it often requires you kind of defending decisions that you make. Yeah. I'm going to dive more into what some of these decisions look like, because Chap, I know you've been really thoughtful about this, both from like a product and a business model perspective, right? I mean, you talked in general about having trust as kind of this horizontal cultural layer. Can you share a little bit about how that's kind of manifest in some of the product choices that you've made? Can you talk a little bit about how that's manifest in some of the business model decisions that you made? For example, like some of the folks that you've kind of prioritized trying to reach out to in terms of consumers?
Yeah, so our customer base has a terrible reputation, right? Like general contractors rank second to only used car salesmen in terms of number of complaints every year. So we had a very so there's that just sort of broad sort of perspective. There's also these are small businesses with not a ton of data around them, right? Like there's not a ton of like really accurate who are good actors, who are bad actors. And from a very early stage, one of the core questions, we have a lending component to our business. One of the core questions for us was, do we go and find a debt facility and make mistakes on a debt facility, knowing that if we made a wrong bet, that is our company's, reputation at risk, our ability to raise debt further on, raise equity dollars? Or do we say, hey, we need to make small bets to sort of understand how to trust folks where there isn't a lot of sort of information to be able to say, here's why contractor A is more or less trustworthy than contractor B. And that was a massive risk for us because we use balance sheet dollars to do that. And that's a core tension between me being able to bring on every incremental contractor and hire folks, right? And, where we got to from a team perspective was it was more important for us to get that sort of like selection process right than it was to, and what we traded off there was saying like, we will try to find more contractors, even if that means that I need to handle more of like sales or my co-founder needs to handle more of the operations part of it, and really push some of us past a little bit of a breaking point. Because I think that's it, to the point where it's really easy to say, oh, only take the like folks with great thumbtack reviews or people who are satisfying a certain set of criteria. So that was a really good example of like how we needed to take a risk there and sort of like be willing to sacrifice some of our own time and our own dollars to make sure we have a good sense of how to do that.
So relatedly, I think for both Rhonda and Arthur, and Chap, if you want to chime in on this too, can you tell us about a time where you were, or one of the companies you've worked with, in the case of Arthur or Rhonda, has been like especially proud of kind of the impact that they were having? And was there some type of company infrastructure that led to that outcome, or kind of, as Chap alluded to, some type of incentive structure that led to that outcome? Can you share a bit about that? Maybe Rhonda, we can start with you.
Yeah, I'm thinking about when companies feel proud of their impact and when folks within companies feel proud of the impact. And the thing that's coming to my mind, honestly, is just the prevalence of real dissonance there. So I do think I could run through a list of organizations that in their eyes are making a lot of progress. And at the same time, I can also conjure up very real stories and realities of folks within those organizations who would say that it's not progress, it's repair, or it's not progress, it's just like long overdue work. And so things that would make me proud. And it's funny because I was just talking with someone earlier and they were like, so like, who's getting it right? That's like the question we keep getting. And it's so tough because literally, if you would have asked me a month ago, name a company that's getting it right, perhaps one would come to mind. And that same company is in the headlines right now because of how they're handling certain issues, you know? So it's like, I can't name a company that I would say, or even in conversations with our community, we would say they're really knocking it out of the park. The question becomes, are the things that they're doing sustained even when it gets tough? You know, how do they respond when there's a breach? What do they do when there's a need for repair? And so I would say, like, for me, this is just an issue of real dissonance between perhaps self-congratulatory, glossy reports and, you know, massaged metrics, and the very essential work of like sustaining the change that folks within companies have been calling for, demanding, and often at great personal and professional risk. So this is just a place of dissonance for me in total candor.
Super powerful. And I think that stark difference, or that the dissonance that you're speaking to, I think speaks to why we're all here. I mean, we're thinking about the very mixed role at best that technology and technology companies have had on kind of the panoply of crises that we're facing at the moment, and about how this next generation of companies has to be better. I think what's one of the really interesting, seemingly kind of recurring themes in what each of you has shared is this idea that to get it right requires some type of upfront investment. Like, there's kind of a broader view that maybe there's a cost, that it's a cost center generally, but it also seems like, I mean, Rhonda, based on that testimony, like that in the long run, it will come back to you. Like there is real cost to not getting these issues right up front. So I just think that's super powerful. Arthur, I don't know if you want to chime in on that.
Yeah, I love that point, Rhonda, on dissonance. I mean, the thing that I've been thinking a lot about, especially in this last year, because we are looking at we know that a labor market right now where a record number of people are changing jobs. The truth is that organizations are really under capacity to navigate a great deal of very complex work. And this is heartfelt work that, needs to be navigated, but it requires space. And there's a challenge that we've created sometimes even a false sense of urgency. The startup world, as we all know, is plagued by this challenge that everything's urgent, right? And when we act in the state of urgency without a lot of capacity, we make really bad decisions typically, right? So one of the things I've been giving a lot of thought to is how do we fundamentally shift responsibility and democratize responsibility of this body of work across our organization? Because one of the things that has happened when we have named CSR, when we've named DEI, and we've then anointed people to be the owners, the sole owners of these things in our organizations, is we've actually, in many cases, taken ownership from the broader organization. We've said, great, we have a new head of diversity. They're going to fix this for us. And it's actually created a vacuum. The organizations I'm actually most proud of from an impact standpoint have been the ones that have created, where leadership specifically has created a culture where every person feels a sense of responsibility for this work. Where every person shows up and says, I know it's not written in my formal job description, but I personally feel on the hook to grow diversity here. When I'm hiring for my next role as a frontline manager, diversity matters to me because it's needed for our team. When I'm mindful of the impact, the carbon footprint we have for the environment, I'm thinking about the decisions we make and the implications there. And if we can create that culture and mindset among our people, we do this together. And I've seen some really cool structures where organizations have said, let's create literally working groups across every single aspect of our work, internally and externally, that has a DEI lens. How we build our products, how we work with our communication, how we build our talent structure. And literally have created like working groups cross-functionally, cross-discipline across their organizations. And everyone has been playing an active role, above and beyond their core job. And I think, Rhonda, to your point earlier, it hasn't been this like voluntary thing. It's been actually accounted for in people's goal setting. And this hasn't been like, do your job and then do this on the side. It's like, this is a core part of your portfolio, So I just think that shift in responsibility and ownership is the capacity that makes this work sustainable.
Can I
go for
add
it,
just one thing and push us even further with this idea of ownership? Because when you said, even when it's not built into the job description, I think that is the case that so many folks find themselves in, and it impacts everyone differently, especially folks who are doing that work and it's not built into the job description. So I would say, especially as a community of founders, like if we're serious about collective ownership, then it does need to be reflected in what folks are tasked to do. It does need to be reflected in performance management, in compensation, right? Because it is a resource, an organizational resource to dedicate time and capacity to this work. And so, especially as you all are building and thinking about what your values are and how you want them to show up, we do measure what we care about. And so I would just put that.
I completely echo that. And, when LinkedIn actually started compensating its ERG leaders, that was one step of many that was needed. We can't treat this work like it's voluntary, icing on the cake. It's not core. It has to be considered core. I think that's part of how we built that mindset.
Articulated and distributed. And I think back to this idea of like equity of power. So I'm going to ask just two more questions before we open it up to our in-person audience and our virtual audience for questions. So Arthur, you had mentioned kind of this like culture of urgency in the Valley that I know we've all experienced. And Chap, I think in that environment, you did something really, really courageous that I don't hear a lot about. I think, when you mentioned when you're a founder, you're running through the rain and the sticks and everything, all these sorts of pressures, and you actually turned down the check. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like, and maybe like, but how maybe that, because I know subsequently, right, you have been able to make a meaningful attempt at building a company that really reflects your values, which go deep into equity and home ownership and in really subtle, nuanced, and thoughtful ways. So can you speak a little bit to what that was like, and whether you're glad you did it, and what it maybe enabled you to do subsequently?
Yeah. In the moment, it was arguably one of the most terrifying things I've done as a founder. Just to be very honest for a moment, I am not a founder that has, I sort of need this to work, right? This isn't just sort of oh, cool. If this doesn't work, I can go find another job, but I don't have a massive set of personal financial resources. And so, there is a huge internal pressure to make sure that I feel comfortable and that my team feels comfortable. That being said, back to the idea of incentive structures and alignments, this was not somebody that we felt was going to be in alignment with our incentive structures. And the trade-off there for me, and then at that moment my co-founder, was, are we willing to, like, we have to believe that the pattern of this interaction so far is going to continue throughout the rest of our company, and they would not be the majority stakeholder for forever, but in the important years, when we go from 3 to 10 to 15 to 20, they would be there. And it was a long conversation around that. And we had to say, like, we still believe that this is a core value of like how we want to build our team. And if they're not aligned now, they're never going to be aligned. And I don't want to incur that risk, right? And I think luckily we had folks on our cap table at that moment who were supportive of that, because that's not just a risk that I'm taking personally. That's a risk for my team. That's a risk for my investors at that point. And it's hard, and I think it gets incrementally harder with like the degree of pedigree or sort of sway that a particular investor can have in an area. But I think this is like one of the it's decisions like this. It's also hiring people. Like, hey, I don't get great vibes from this person, but they have a great pedigree. Like, this is a really tangible trade-off that I think founders have to make early, and there is no magical way around it. It is hard, and you just have to sort of lean into like what you feel needs to be true for the next 5 years of the business and where you want to be, and quite frankly, like who you want supporting you throughout.
Thank you for being real with us. That's super powerful. I think even if you can internalize it as a long-term risk in the moment, still so much weight, still so difficult to actually execute on. Davida Herzl, the CEO of Aklima, in our previous conversation, talked about it as protecting your future self, which I thought was a useful frame. So with that, I'm going to encourage folks online to put questions in the chat. Nada, I think you're in camp downstairs at BetaWorks where we're broadcasting this. If maybe you could field questions and throw them into the chat. And while we're collecting those, I'll just finish with one more question for everyone, which is just what advice would you have for founders as they try to build their companies in socially positive ways?
First thing I'd say is hang out with Lyel, right? Do more of this kind of stuff. Coffee with Lyel is always a good option there. I think the big thing is, that I think is parallel to everything we've been saying is truly to slow down. I mean, it is, I can't tell you how meaningful it is for me to just hear the thoughtful discourse of this conversation. It's not a conversation that's happening among many founders. Most are saying, cool, when am I exiting? What am I doing? Bam, bam, bam. And just to slow down right now. If we slow down, we can make decisions that are usually way, way, way more thoughtful. Powerful. And I think speed is always going to be our greatest our greatest kind of enemy in this line of work.
Thanks for that, Arthur. Chapman and Rhonda, you get the last word.
Yeah, the default assumption for every startup is that you're going to fail, right? And I think one of the better pieces of advice I got early on was to write yourself a letter in the future of, if you fail, what would you be happy with in terms of the reasons that you're going to fail? And what would you not be happy with? And it's scary because you have to sort of like face the like mortality of the company. But I think when you start to get comfortable with like, what are the future failure patterns? Like, it makes you more aware of them as you're getting started, and how you sort of avoid those little incremental steps that lead you down those paths.
Awesome. Thank you. Super powerful. Rhonda, if you want to bring us home, and then we'll have time for hopefully 2 questions from the audience. Rhonda, go for it.
Cool. I just keep coming back to the importance of clarifying your values and how you want them to show up year 2, year 5, year 10, and then teaming up with people who can help you make that happen from a place of integrity and partnership.
I think the weight on introspection is not something that we hear enough about as founders, and I will triple down on that. Thank you, Rhonda. So we have a couple questions online. Thank you, Michael and Claire. But we also have I told you we are live from BetaWorks, and we are. So if we have, can you share your name and affiliation real quick, and maybe just if you want to pan the room so people could see that there are in fact people that are live here.
People that aren't on Zoom.
Yeah, cool.
What is this?
Okay.
No, let's not do that because the cable's really sensitive.
Okay, sorry. So don't do that. So just name and affiliation and go ahead and ask the question.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Noah. I'm currently getting my MBA at Cornell Tech. So hi, Lyel. And I'll maybe be taking a class with Lyel next semester. I was curious. So obviously there are inherent advantages to having a business that has good DNA, values DEI, but part of the value add is also the image that you're able to portray. So I'm curious if you guys have best practices to avoid it becoming a virtue signaling thing where you're more projecting an image of we care about DEI without actually having the bones there. Do you recommend not publicly broadcasting things that you're proud of and that at the beginning to make sure that it's genuine? Yeah, curious if you guys have thoughts.
Great question. Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I guess I've seen this both at my time at Google and at other startups. I think it's really easy to fall into we want the United Colors of Benetton style of diversity, which I think is what you're sort of getting towards. I think that, where I view this is you want to look at everybody in your team and say they embody something really core that is valuable to what the mission you need to achieve, and have a really clear answer on and this is the thing that you don't see in the work history or the school logo that says, this is why Rhonda is going to help us succeed, or this is why Art is going to help us succeed. I think as long as you can have confidence in that, broadcasting that is then sort of a decision on how you want your company to, broadly speaking, be perceived.
Mm-hmm. So either you, Rhonda or Arthur, want to chime in on it? Rhonda?
Yeah, I'll just add that on the transparency and broadcasting front, often, the virtue signaling comes in when there's an imbalanced story that's being shared. And so if you're sharing the data, share the data. And if you're sharing what's working, get real about what's not working. I think there's a lot of respect to be gained in those moments that aren't going well. And so I would just name that, I think it's okay to share, but if you're going to do that, really commit to being balanced in that sharing.
Yeah. And Lyel, I would just build on what Rhonda was saying, we see sort of two problematic things that are happening right now. One is performative activism, right? And I think the virtue signaling. And the other is actually this sort of hesitation to share anything until everything's been figured out. And that's actually problematic because we're not bringing our community along. We're not building transparency. So, I think it gets back to what Rhonda was mentioning earlier, which is start with the values. If this really is this work matters to you, articulate what you want to do and how you want to see this change through, and then bring your community along. But make that something that is about really building a partnership and not about just projecting, the United Colors of Benetton, as Chap was saying. I think there's a balance there.
I think that's a great way to wrap. Unfortunately, we're right at time. I think this recurring theme that of kind of the work of introspection and building process to ensure trust might be a cost center upfront or requires time and investment upfront. But in the long run, if you don't get it right, there are real costs associated with it. I think is really powerful. So I'm so grateful to the three of you. It's wonderful to see you all just in general, and to see you all together. It makes me super happy. If we could have a virtual round of applause, and for the folks downstairs in camp, if you could turn the mic on and real applause. I want to thank Chap. Check out Brick App. I want to thank Arthur. Check out Matheson, and want to thank Rhonda, who is also a visiting practitioner at Cornell Tech. Check out Devcolor. The three of you, thank you so much. It was great to see you. I hope you stick around for the rest of the conference. For what's next, for those of you online, please join Sam Brown's ethical risk consequence scanning workshop. Sam is awesome. She came up with this really powerful framework when she was at .everyone in the UK. She's going to lead a workshop around consequence scanning and ethical risk. If you are here in New York at BetaWorks, I'm going to lead an ethical risk workshop downstairs in camp. So we'll see all of you soon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.